Susan Stewart, the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and I've been tasked with introducing our luncheon speaker, Jason Abel. As Professor Herzig suggests, he's of counsel at Steptoe & Johnson, and he has a decade of experience in both the public sector and private sector. For 2 years, Jason was counsel to Senator Schumer, where he managed a varied portfolio that involved the issues of many Senate committees, including the Judiciary, Banking, and Commerce Committee. From 2009 to 2011, he acted as chief counsel of the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, where he developed in-depth knowledge of Senate rules and procedures and oversaw numerous legislative oversight and nominations hearings. He worked with Senate leaders on both sides of the aisle to craft and execute strategy for several successful pieces of bipartisan legislation. Most recently, the bipartisan Senate leadership group that streamlined the Senate confirmation process and reformed the presidential appointment process. He was also the lead Senate aide for campaign finance issues, including the Disclose Act, Democratic response to the Supreme Court's opinion in Citizens United versus FEC. If that weren't enough, he has years of experience counseling clients on the complex intersection of law and political activity by advising Fortune 100 companies and global financial institutions on compliance with federal, state, and local pay-to-play law, campaign finance law, and government ethics, including gift and entertainment restrictions. Please welcome to Valparaiso University Law School, Jason Abel, who will be speaking on corruption, speech, and money, a brief history of the world post-Citizens United.
Just first, let me start off by thanking Patricia and everybody else here at Valpo. These conferences are very difficult to put on logistically, so I want to thank everybody for their time and their hard work. And it really is an honor to be here with these amazing panelists, and the discussion we've had so far has been fantastic. It's also nice to be back in Valpo. My dad grew up on the south side of Chicago, right by where the Skyway is, and he had cousins that lived here, so more times than probably I remember, we drove out here to Valpo. So it's nice to be back here. And let's see, this PowerPoint works. I'm experimenting with PowerPoint here, so just be patient here. So a little bit about me. As was mentioned, I was counsel to Senator Schumer, that guy there, and then chief counsel of the Senate Rules Committee. There I am, forgetting my sunglasses, so trying not to be blinded by the sun. So, yeah, I think we talked about Congress's approval rating. I think the 17% could partly be attributed to me, so just hold the tomatoes that you throw me until after at least I'm done. Got to give the necessary disclaimer here that what I say doesn't represent the views of Steptoe & Johnson, doesn't represent the views of Senator Schumer or anybody in the Senate for that matter. Sometimes it might not even represent me, but we'll keep going. So the title of my presentation is A Brief History of the World. So by world, I actually mean inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., and more specifically, inside the Capitol, because folks there sometimes think they are the center of the world and the world itself. I'm going to be primarily talking about legislative efforts to address the issues that we heard all morning here, basically to reform the campaign finance system after Citizens United back in January. So I think the title of the symposium references the good, the bad, and the ugly. I get to talk about the ugly. I get to talk about the sausage-making process and the good and bad of that in particular. So the key question here that I think we're trying to address, and something that really is the foremost on everybody's minds, and the Onion put it pretty succinctly, is, money and politics, are they somehow connected? I think we know the answer to that. And I think in seriousness, the issue here is what, if anything, could be done moving forward. We had to deal with Citizens United and Speech Now, which I'll talk about later, and now McCutcheon. The very recent jurisprudence in this area about corruption and what is considered corruption and how you can then regulate that, there might be very little for Congress to do going forward. Now, I think we've heard some alternate theories today, which I think are fascinating, definitely want to learn more about it. But focusing on corruption, Congress's hands might be tied a bit. So I think we might have to look to a new crop of regulators here. Bit creative, somewhat unconventional, was talked a little bit about earlier, but one of these regulators could be the SEC, not the FEC, but the SEC. So the first part here, congressional efforts to reform the campaign finance process. So I think it's important to start by looking backwards, because it's always fun to relive failed efforts in a painful history. But I think it will assist us in figuring out whether Congress will be helpful or live up to its wonderful 17% approval rating going forward. So January 21st, 2010, we have Citizens United. And at that point, I was right in the middle of the storm. I was chief counsel for Senator Schumer. My mom was very happy to see that picture on the front page there of the New York Times webpage. But maybe other than my mom, this was the attitude that most people took. The caption here, the Roberts Court just calls balls and strikes, and then Chief Justice Roberts saying, strike him again, he's someone with a baseball bat and a guy laying on the ground, it says campaign finance law. What's most interesting is at the very bottom, you might not be able to read it, it says 5 or 6 more and he'll be out. So I think that that was a little interesting considering we're a couple more into that and how many more do we need before it's actually out. So right after the opinion comes down, we have to figure out a strategy. We know we need legislation. We have been predicting most likely a 5-4 opinion along these lines from the beginning. We had teamed up with Congressman Chris Van Hollen from Maryland's office to work on a bicameral and hopefully bipartisan piece of legislation. Van Hollen was able to get then Congressman Mike Hassel and Walter Jones to sign on almost immediately to these efforts. Now, in the Senate, we didn't have as much luck. We first reached out to Senator McCain of McCain-Feingold fame. I think the conversation lasted about 5 minutes before he said, "We're not interested. Thanks for talking to us." That could have been because he was at the time possibly facing a difficult primary in Arizona, but he wasn't interested. So now it's interesting to hear him back to his old reformer status. Lindsey Graham, he asked us, well, what's McCain doing? So that pretty much ended that. Dan Cochran, who interestingly had been supportive of a constitutional amendment to reverse the Buckley decision, but he didn't want to play. Former Senator Lugar, who said, I don't want to be 60. What I mean by that is he didn't want to be the 60th vote to allow the bill to go forward. He'd be happy if another Republican signed on first. Then we have Scott Brown, who, former senator from Massachusetts, now apparently a resident of New Hampshire, who we spoke to for a period of months. And I'll talk a little bit more about those discussions, but he was initially supportive and then decided he wasn't supportive. And then there's, Susan Collins and Olivia Snow. Susan Collins wanted to do what Senator Joe Lieberman was doing, and Joe Lieberman was supporting, but then Senator Collins decided she wasn't going to. And we had conversations with Olivia Snow for months until she decided that she would not be supporting the bill. And then, see, technical glitch. Someone could just help me out here. There we go. And Senator Lisa Murkowski, who we spoke to both at the beginning of the efforts and then before the second vote on disclose in September, who, let's just say we were very close to having her be the 60th vote. With that being said, none of the Republicans signed out on the Senate side, so we had the Disclose Act of 2010, which was just Senator Schumer, Representative Van Hollen, and the name of the bill, which some folks here have had a fun time, stands for Democracy is Strengthened by Casting Light on Spending in Elections, or the Disclose Act. Little bit. We came up with the idea to call it the Disclose Act before we filled in the blanks. People have asked that. I didn't come up with that, long, drawn-out name before Disclose. So originally in the Senate, there were 49 original co-sponsors. It was almost identical to the House version. There were a few minor differences, which I'll explain, but the idea was it was going to go forward together. It would be a show of strength. That being said, the effort to rather polarize it. This was a cartoon in the Wall Street Journal. It may have accompanied an op-ed that one of our speakers may have written. I don't know if that was the particular correlation of that, but the idea here was, listen, you guys are helping unions, you guys are suppressing speech, and you're tearing up the First Amendment. That was the attacks we got from the right. Then I'd go to some meetings on the far left, and it was, you're destroying unions, you're not being strong enough, and you're not utilizing the space that the Supreme Court has given you to make changes. So in the end, it was really, you can't win. Now, there are certain times where when you're in a position and you have legislation that can't win and doesn't really make anybody happy, that's the type of legislation that gets passed. Unfortunately here, that was not the case. But really, here's what the Disclose Act actually did. It would have 4 titles. The first title tried to reinstitute some prohibitions that, let's just say, may have been arguably constitutional. But there were some provisions in there saying that if you are a government contractor, you've accepted TARP money, you cannot conduct independent expenditures from your general treasury. We tightened up some of the foreign controls. If you remember the State of the Union, President Obama famously got up there and said that there would be foreign control of our elections. He was actually incorrect in the way he phrased it, but this would have tightened some of the relationships between foreign parent companies and its U.S. subs. We messed around with a couple technical issues by taking what would currently be defined as an issue ad, call Senator Schumer and tell him to vote for this bill, and depending on its proximity to an election, we turn that into an electioneering communication, which means it would then be regulated. And we also tried to work in a couple of party rehabilitating measures. And this is a theme that we see post-McCutcheon is maybe after McCutcheon, the parties will be getting a bit stronger. And there have been a couple of op-eds written about now the parties and party committees will be able to have a little bit more money to spend in elections. And maybe that could cover some of this undisclosed money. The meat of the bill was Title II, and that was disclosing both spending and donors. And that was a topic that the last panel discussed. Included in spending was disclosing transfer of money. This would be from entities that would be considered covered. So who do we define as covered? For-profit, taxable corporations, 501c4s, unions, 501c6s, 527s. All of these entities would be covered, and if they met the thresholds, would be forced to disclose under election law. So this bill would have moved the disclosure from any tax law over to election law. In addition to that, there would have been disclaimers. You see those really annoying commercials around election time. Jason Abel, I approve this message. We would have applied that to the equally annoying interest group commercials by making the head of the organization stand up and say they approve the message, but also the top funder of the organization stand up there and approve the message. And if that wasn't enough, we would have the top 5 donors to that entity appear on the screen. One of the criticisms that we received was you're taking a 30-second ad, and after you do the 2 stand by your ads, you're left with 10 seconds. I'm not going to do it here. I did it. It takes 7 seconds to do. So not that much longer than a long drawn-out campaign candidate stand by your ad. We also added a couple technical lobbyist disclosures, so you get a better sense of who and which lobbyists were spending what money. So Title III built on this idea of disclosure, and it required real-time disclosure on a website, and also for certain entities, shareholder disclosure. Interestingly, a lot of this particular language was drafted by our Republican counterparts. We inserted this language in an attempt to gain their support. They backed down and left the language in there. So it's interesting to hear some of the debate back and forth about how Republicans were not given a chance to influence this very partisan protection of Democratic interest legislation, yet a lot of their language is actually in the bill. Finally, the last part relates to something called lowest unit rate. And currently, candidates, when they buy airtime, are given by the broadcast companies the lowest rate for that particular ad. This would have expanded it to the parties and party committees. The idea was, now you're going to have all the spending, so more people are using the spending to buy advertisements on TV. It's going to drive up the cost of advertisements, and the parties are going to suffer. This would have given the party and party committees the lowest unit rate along with the candidates. So, a couple points before I get to other measures about the functioning of how the Disclose Act would work. And I think it would hit on friends earlier talk about following the money in the daisy chain of various entities. One of the big concerns at that time wasn't huge corporate flood of money. It was the placement of that money into undisclosable entities. And the idea was we would give these entities a choice. So C4 or C6, you could set up essentially a separate segregated fund. We called it the campaign-related activity account. There was a push at the time to call it the campaign-related activity, you find something that begins with P account to fully, if you put it together, CRAP account. We decided not to do that. But if you set up a separate account and solely use that account for political spending, by political spending I mean express advocacy and electioneering communications, then you would really have to disclose at a low level those that contributed directly to that account. There would still be a disclosure for your general donors, but it would essentially raise that threshold. If you decided not to set up one of those accounts, then really you were stuck with a $600 disclosure threshold for all donors to your C4s and C6s or unions. One of the critiques that we got was the Democrats purposefully set the amount at $600. They calculated this, they figured this out, and this was to protect the unions because union dues fall right under $600. I wish we were that smart. Really what happened was Chris Van Hollen wanted it at 1,000, Mike Castle wanted it at 200, and they split the difference. That was true. So the idea to push a unified response to Citizens United to address a lot of these issues came really somewhat under attack, not just from outside groups like the Chamber of Commerce and some far left groups, but also we had to deal with members, because I know you'd be surprised to hear this, but some members have egos and they want their bill being pushed forward. So we had constitutional amendments to deal with, reversing Buckley, taking away corporate First Amendment rights. There was public financing, for instance, the Fair Elections Now Act, shareholder disclosure and approval bills, more constitutional amendments, foreign control bans, so picking apart a share of the Disclose Act and pushing it forward, essentially saying if you're a U.S. sub, you're not allowed to spend at all in elections. and more shareholder approvals. It was very difficult to keep these out of the agenda. The thought process was, we're only going to get one shot at this, and there's only going to be one attempt to solve this problem. Given the fact that the House was still under Democratic control, given that we had 59 votes, this was going to be our shot. Let's not push a measure that doesn't even enjoy the full support of the Democratic caucus. So while this was happening, Speech Now was decided. And really, you know, there's been a lot of talk of what Citizens United actually did, but really, this is the kicker. Because Citizens United and Speech Now, plus a couple of advisory opinions from the FEC, this created super PACs. This created these independent expenditure groups that can spend as much as they want and get as much in donations as they want without limits. Because under the wisdom of Justice Kennedy, independent spending can never corrupt. So this took it to the next level. And I think this cartoon was also right, that we saw, and we still continue to see major advertising from super PACs in the election. Most famously, it's referenced earlier, the Stephen Colbert super PAC, Making a Better Tomorrow, and he famously appeared with one of Paul's colleagues in front of the FEC, Trevor Potter, and really, I think it was the most attention the FEC got positive attention they got in years. So the House passed some changes. The House made some changes to the bill that ended up passing this close. These changes were well, I was going to say rather, but I'll say very controversial because they were viewed as loopholes. Most famously was called the NRA loophole. Essentially, the bill had a carve-out from the definition of a covered organization for quote-unquote well-established 501c4s. So if you've been around a certain amount of years, you have a certain number of members, the idea was, we know when the Sierra Club is making an ad, it's coming from the Sierra Club. We know what they stand for, we know what they represent. We don't need to pierce their shield and get at their donors. This was a tough one to swallow because it also meant that the NRA got its way with this particular bill. They had threatened to score the bill, which meant, you know, this was back in 2010, right before the midterms. A lot of folks, rightfully so, were concerned about losing their seats. And the NRA deciding to score the bill essentially meant that if the House negotiators didn't accept what they wanted, then the bill would be dead. It would not have passed the House. So we got the bill and we made some further changes. And there was a labor loophole inserted, sort of the 11th hour, that allowed, and I'm not saying it was done maliciously, but it allowed different unions, national and local chapters, to transfer money and avoid some of the disclosure requirements. We put a threshold on that so it wouldn't be seen as a loophole where money could be shifted around. We added additional disclaimers. Overall, many provisions in the House passed version remain. We took out the lowest unit rate because we needed to cut down on the amount of enemies that were coming in to the bill. We didn't need the broadcasters opposing it at the time. We increased the government contractor prohibition. So the original bill, it was $50,000. So if you have a government contract of $50,000, you were prohibited from spending. In the newer version, it was increased to about $10 million. And to be honest, it could have been increased to about $100 million or $500 million, and it still would have captured the top 50 or 100 government contractors. And there were a few other tweaks that we made, as you see, and you know, finally, much to the chagrin of many members, the C4 exception was left into the bill. So there was a new version of the bill that was produced. This was in July of 2010, and it's a little personal story. My son was born on July 22nd, 2010. So in the run-up to the Disclose Act coming to the floor, my wife was 9 and then, you know, essentially 10 months pregnant. So either somebody had an amazing sense of coincidence or sense of humor at Politico, because this was the story right after my son was born. Schumer to push new campaign law. So that was an odd headline. But the bill was a new bill was reintroduced, brought directly to the floor, and the attitude was, yeah, good luck. You don't have a 60th vote, you're not going to get one, so nothing really is going to happen here. So that was July 27th. I'm trying to stay awake after 4 sleepless nights with the newborn, and the bill clearly was filibustered. Not to be outdone, we had to have a second vote, just to fully, nail in the pain here. And the bill got 59 votes for, 39 against, and was defeated. I think you can have a whole nother symposium on the legislative process and gridlock, but you have a piece of legislation that the House of Representatives voted for. The president indicated he would sign, and 59 senators voted for the bill, 20 more that voted against the bill, and it wasn't law. So really what we were concerned about from the beginning was this 501c4 and C6 spending. If you can read, this was now around Halloween, and it's presumably a kid in a box, and Uncle Sam handing out candy saying, "Oh, and who is this, and what are you?" And he says, "Not telling," and on the side it says, "Secret campaign contribution." So that was, I think, what we were concerned about, and what drove our efforts here. So in the next Congress, we have another version of the Disclose Act. They made some changes. Interestingly, the Democrats were negotiating against themselves, because another version was introduced and more things were taken out of the bill, which, if you've taken a negotiation class, not really the way you go about trying to get what you want in a bill, by unilaterally removing it without getting anything in return. But they clearly did it, and was really left in the next Congress with just pure disclosure. Nothing else, no prohibitions, no disclaimers, pure disclosure. They held a midnight vigil. I was happy I was no longer in the Senate. I still wasn't sleeping, but happy I wasn't having to stay there. But we got the same result. And the harsh headlines continue to follow. But yes, it clearly did die again. So Democrats were faced with a choice. See here, welcome to the dark side, Luke. And it's President Obama shaking hands with Darth Vader that says Super PACs on it. And there was the thought of, well, how are we going to run a competitive election while at the same time trying to push for rules changes? And there were some folks that thought, well, you cannot embrace super PACs, you cannot embrace 501c4 or C6 spending, because we're trying to get disclosure of that, and it would just be wrong. And I think the response was, well, sometimes being right doesn't win elections. And if you want any changes, elections need to be won. So that was, much, I think, to the disappointment of some, that was the attitude that was taken. The most recent Congress had, once again, the Disclose Act, although this time it's called the Disclosure of Information on Spending on Campaigns Leads to Open and Secure Elections Act of 2013. So they were, I guess, upset with the words previously, and they changed it on the House side. You also have the Empowering Citizens Act, which really was a public financing bill combined with a super PAC restriction bill. And what the Empowering Citizens Act does is it defines a single candidate super PAC and the spending that single candidate super PAC does as essentially an in-kind contribution to that candidate. And because it's an in-kind contribution, its spending therefore could be limited. On the Senate side, you had now finally a bipartisan effort. You had Senators Murkowski and Wyden introducing the Follow the Money Act, which really wasn't that popular. As of yesterday, the only co-sponsor is Senator Murkowski. So after all this talk about needing a bipartisan bill and no one wanting to go first, there is a bipartisan bill and it's going nowhere fast. And you know, I think part of the problem with that particular bill is that they were trying to reinvent the wheel. Admittedly, disclose was very partisan in the end, and they tried to invent a new way of getting disclosure of C4s and C6s, and not really getting at it to the degree that I think disclose did. So really the issue here with McCutcheon and throwing out the aggregate limits is now what? Now what are we going to be able to do? What is Congress going to be able to do? Is Congress going to actually be able to accomplish anything here? And there are some folks that say, yeah, they will when pigs fly, or when hell freezes over, or when the Cubs win the World Series. So essentially, no. I think then it's, well, who are we going to, you know, who are the folks that want additional regulation in this area? What entities can they turn to get some, I would say, some regulation in this area? So talk a little bit about a new series of regulators here in this space. So we all know about the FEC. It's been talked about a little bit before. One of the commissioners just wrote a New York Times op-ed about how it's unable to enforce its own laws of regulations. Interesting though, the split is not partisan. The split is ideological. It breaks down on partisan lines. You do have 3 Republican commissioners and 3 Democratic commissioners, but really it divides into those that are in favor of regulation and those that are more in favor of deregulation. And that really makes the FEC somewhat irrelevant in this area going forward. I'm not calling them completely, just in some of the areas going forward. The White House, to further some conspiracies, had issued a draft executive order that would have required disclosure of political spending for government contractors. It was written rather sloppily, and they ended that after it was leaked. The idea was, you know, you're going to decide who gets a government contract based on their political contributions. And the way that the executive order was actually structured, those political contributions had to have been disclosed before contracts were awarded. So there was some, I think, legitimate fear that that would actually happen. The state activity, and it was talked about a bit earlier, the California Fair Political Practices Commission went after 501c4 activity in California, and we could see that as a model moving forward, how interested are state regulators and state officials to take on this type of activity. One area that I think is gaining a little bit more strength, and at the same time there's no one pure definition of it, are pay-to-play laws. And what pay-to-play laws essentially do is they restrict campaign contributions by those that do business with government, federal, state, or local. So I have a Google alert for SEC pay-to-play, and I don't know how many college football fans are here, but frequently it comes up with college football hits, which I think talks about the sad state of affairs with college athletics. But you get, you know, frequently Alabama paid this player to play in the SEC, the Southeastern Conference. But that's not what we're talking about here. On the federal level, you have the MSRB, the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, which has jurisdiction over municipal securities dealers. You have the SEC, which in this case regulates investment advisors, and the CFTC, which regulates swap dealers. And really what these pay-to-play rules do is, before I get to the state and local level, is they essentially say if you are a certain employee of, let's just take the SEC rule for investment advisors. If you're a certain employee called a covered associate of the investment advisor, and you make a contribution to a covered official, then you cannot receive compensated services for 2 years after that contribution. And if you seek out or receive compensated services within that 2-year period, it would be a violation of the rule. So you'd be subject to strict monetary penalties, disgorgement. The issue here is, well, who's considered a covered official? This applies in federal, state, or local elections. If a mayor is running for re-election, the SEC their rule actually controls how much certain employees of investment advisors can contribute to a mayor running for re-election if that mayor, being a covered official, has the ability to influence the selection of an investment advisor or appoint someone that has the ability to influence the selection of an investment advisor. The idea here is, don't give $10,000 to the mayor, then he's going to give you a contract to help manage the city's money. But it also applies to state elections too, because statewide officials can be considered covered officials as well, but also federal elections. In Ohio, the state treasurer, Josh Mandel, is considered a covered official. He's a state treasurer, he manages the state's money. He was running for Senate. So in that case, investment advisors were restricted far below the current contribution limits in how much they would be able to give his Senate campaign. Similarly, and this is an issue possibly going forward, is the current governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, is a covered official. He is most certainly, if he runs, going to solicit or attempt to solicit money from Wall Street. A lot of the folks on Wall Street are registered investment advisors. He would run up against this pay-to-play rule because those individuals would only be able to give him a couple $100, and we're oversimplifying here, as opposed to the thousands of dollars that they would be able to give him under current campaign finance law. This then raises the idea that this money would be driven outside of this regulated system to 501c4s that would run advertisements on Christie's behalf or to super PACs. And I'll get back to the discussion of super PACs because while the FEC is really deadlocked over what defines coordination between a super PAC and a candidate, the SEC hasn't addressed the issue. And the SEC is not bound by election laws, thank goodness, in a sense. So the SEC has yet to address the question over what constitutes coordination in the case of a super PAC and a covered official for purposes of their pay-to-play rule. That's just federal. We've got state-level pay-to-play rules as well. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut are just some local pay-to-play rules. Chicago has a citywide ordinance restricting certain contributions. On top of that, Rahm Emanuel put in place an executive order that says if you're a lobbyist or you do business with the city, you're prohibited from contributing to one of his political fundraising committees. New York City is very similar. They have a doing business database. So if you're doing business with the city, you're limited in how much money you can give. And then you've got pension funds. Public pension funds from various states or localities that are either governed by those jurisdictions' pay-to-play rules or have in place their own pay-to-play rules. CalPERS, for instance, is one of the bigger ones. They'll have a whole series of ethics laws that will govern interactions between its officials and investment advisors or those in the financial services world. Shifting gears a bit and going back to statewide elected officials, there was a novel theory put forth, it was about a year ago, by the New York State Comptroller DiNapoli to sue Qualcomm in Delaware. And the idea was it was going to sue under Section 220 of the Delaware Code that allows shareholders to inspect an entity's books and records. New York State Comptroller operates the New York State pension funds. The New York State pension funds is a huge investor in Qualcomm. So the idea was, we want to look at your books, we want to see what you're spending money on, because we think it's a proper purpose to say that spending money on political spending in general isn't right, and we want to be able to see that. Shockingly, and I say that sarcastically, they settled before the suit proceeded. But it leaves open this concept of, and to get technical here a bit, is inspection of books and records for political spending, is that considered a proper purpose under Section 220 of the Delaware Code? And I think that is something that's yet to be determined, but we might see another state pick up this argument moving forward. I don't really need to get into it, because I think it was discussed pretty much at length here, but the IRS has attempted in a couple different ways to wade into this battle, and it's just created, and I hesitate to say this, but theater on Capitol Hill. These folks have been used as a pawn in greater administration, House Republican battles, and it's really been a focus of a lot of House Republican oversight, rightfully or wrongfully so. That's just the situation. And then I hit the button too quickly, but there was the proposed rulemaking related to disclosure of limits on 501c4 activity, which I think has been widely panned both on the left and right. If nothing else, I think I've heard some questions being raised, why did they just do C4s and not C6s? So if you go through all this trouble to limit the activity of C4s, you're still going to have the activity of C6s, which will create the same quote-unquote problem. So finishing up, moving forward here, you know, I had a series of what is corruption examples, which I think are rather irrelevant now, but after the touch-in. But you know, they really hit on a few ideas that I think if you were to ask, if we were to go outside and ask random people on the street, is this considered corruption? This is not a scientific statement, but maybe many of them would say that these examples would be considered corruption. Clearly, the Supreme Court does not consider these examples corruption. I think the last one is one that is less about corruption and more about how is that going to be defined going forward. You know, again, I think we have a situation where if corruption is solely defined as quid pro quo corruption, it's going to be very, very difficult for Congress to legislate in this area. They can still hit at some of the disclosure issues, but short of a grand bargain to get disclosure, and this has been floated before, raise individual contribution limits in exchange for disclosure, lift party limits to 6 figures, or some would say lift them all together in exchange for disclosure. That would be a deal that maybe many would take. But then you have the SEC. Now the SEC has dealt with a few different issues here. One, it relates to the petition to disclose political spending to shareholders. It's a very popular petition. It was submitted by several law professors, and it hasn't been acted on. And it was slated for action last year. It was put up on a registry for something that would be on the agenda of the SEC, and then it was pulled. The new chair of the SEC has not brought it up in any further discussion about the agenda. Interestingly, we talk about the rhetoric, and we're all guilty, I think, of ramping up the rhetoric from time to time. But I would posit that some of the same folks that have been critical of Democratic senators reaching out to the IRS to try to get disclosure of spending for C4s and C6s, those same individuals are putting the same pressure on the SEC to not act on this petition. So we'll see what happens on that going forward, but I think it's a safe bet to say that this petition will not be acted on. And again, what I talked about a bit earlier is, will the SEC, especially if Chris Christie runs, expand pay-to-play to cover contributions made to super PACs? Again, this is an issue that has not been decided yet under securities laws, which is what the SEC would decide it under. They're not bound by the FEC's ruling. So the SEC could essentially consider a super PAC to be a committee controlled or affiliated with a covered official, especially a single candidate super PAC. So it's just something interesting to watch going forward to see how much the SEC wants to wade into these battles. So I think in the end, you know, I had the idea when I first started drafting this and started looking at it, I was like, wow, this is amazingly cynical. This is rather down on any prospects for any action whatsoever, depressing for some, happy for others that have been winning these cases. And so I scratched and tried to make a little bit more lighthearted approach here, because I think that, there's always going to be new theories and new ideas. I think we've heard a couple today that could prove a route going forward for Congress or for other entities to re-engage on this issue. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. But thank you for your time. I'm happy to take any questions or any comments. So thank you. Well, it's funny because when I set this up, someone said, talk for 5 minutes and then just take, 45 minutes or so of question and answers. And I, explained that, Brad Smith and Jim Bob would be in the audience, and they looked at me and they said, hey, you know what? Maybe you should talk for about an hour and not take any questions whatsoever. So, but I'm happy to talk now or later on. So.
Anybody have any questions?
You didn't really cover public financing in your talk at all. What's happening either at the federal level or at the states with respect to progress on public financing?
Start at the federal level. I think there are two major public financing proposals that I think have some sort of traction. On the Senate side, there's Senator Durbin's Fair Elections Now Act. That's been around for a while. It's taken various different iterations on. The problem with that, frankly, it doesn't enjoy the support of the entire Democratic caucus. I think that there are those that just don't support both the idea in general, but maybe the way the bill was drafted, and don't want to give opponents the idea, well, this is just more taxpayer-funded elections. Poor politicians, you don't have enough money to spend, so we're going to give you, taxpayers are going to give you money to run your campaigns. On the House side, Chris Van Hollen, as part of the Empowering Citizens Act, has a public financing bill as well. I think the prospects for both right now, given the composition of the houses are rather slim. In the states, there are some entities that do it, and it works very well. I think that New York City, I think, is an example where they have a system in place. I think folks are worried that that's going to be sort of, taking this idea of corruption and how you regulate in this area, that, fearing that public financing is next, considering the court has already shown it's, let's just say it's less than sympathetic to the idea.
The Senate recently changed the filibuster rules for some parts. Would that have had any impact on the Disclose Act? It
No.
failed? That's what I was thinking. It didn't impact that type of bill.
So what the Senate did was, in short, they changed the rules to require 50 votes for a majority vote for cloture on executive branch nominations and judicial nominations, excluding Supreme Court nominations. Clearly, the filibuster rule here prevented this and many other bills brought up by both parties over the years from being enacted into law, but that would not have had any difference.
Yes.
So you were there in Senator Schumann, in the senator's office, working on this Disclose Act. How could you deal with issues of constitutionality about the disclaimer parts of the bill? Because, it raises issues under Talley and McIntyre and all that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. I think that there were a variety of parts of the Disclose Act, admittedly so, that raised constitutional questions. We thought, more so than some of the other questions, with the disclaimer was on solid ground. We thought that the time frame fit within the particular time frame allotted. The issue of forcing the top donor to stand up there was the one that we went back and forth on. In the end, we decided we were on solid ground, but we definitely understood that there would be concerns. you see in later iterations of the bill, in the Follow the Money Act, they have dropped that, the top donor provision. Personally, I still think it's on solid ground, but it is a question, and it would have been one that we would have had to have been prepared to defend.
On the SEC, I guess the word was out that dropping the petition from the agenda was the condition for Mary Jo White's confirmation. Can you comment on that?
I can either confirm or, I don't know. That and some other things would make sense to me, but I can confirm that it was definitely asked about before her confirmation hearing, so whether or not that was the key condition of it. Great, thanks everyone, I appreciate it.